Sherlock Holmes and the Riddle of the Mismatched Shoes. Chapter 1. The Riddle of the Mismatched Shoes. It was on the 11th day of March in the year 1894 that a singularly curious event occurred, one which I might have dismissed as trivial had I not borne witness to the dread weight it would later assume. I had spent the morning tending to a patient near Portland Place, and had just returned to Baker Street shortly past 11, when I found Holmes standing at the window in a posture I knew all too well, hands clasped behind his back, pipe unlit, and his eyes narrowed into that distant gaze he adopted when a mystery was taking root in his mind. "Ah, Watson," he said without turning, "you've missed a visitor of the most enigmatic sort." "A client?" I asked, removing my gloves. "Or another admirer of your monograph on cigar ash?" "Neither," he replied, "though I dare say the matter she left in her wake may prove more tangled than either." He gestured to the table. There, resting inconspicuously atop the morning newspaper, lay a single women's walking shoe. It was a modest specimen. Black leather, scuffed at the toe and frayed slightly at the lace holes. Its sole bore the wear of long use, yet the stitching remained intact. But what struck me most, even before Holmes spoke another word, was the simple oddness of its presence. There was no note, no calling card, no second shoe. "She left it," Holmes said, now lighting his pipe with slow deliberation. "Without name, without explanation. She entered, presented the shoe, and departed within the span of a minute. Mrs. Hudson was too surprised to stop her. "Good heavens," I murmured, lifting the shoe carefully. "Did she say anything at all?" Holmes inhaled deeply. "Only that the other shoe belonged to a dead woman. Then she turned on her heel and vanished into the fog." I examined it more closely. "It's nothing out of the ordinary, surely. A well-worn walking shoe, women's size 5, perhaps 5.5, slight drag pattern on the heel, nothing to suggest—" "Ah, but that's where you're wrong, my dear Watson," Holmes interrupted. "You must learn to observe, not merely see." He tapped the toe of the shoe. "Note the angle of wear here. Consistent with a slight pronation of the foot, a tendency more common in men than women. But the leather, matte, not patent, and the narrow taper of the instep suggest it is indeed a woman's. However, it is not new. This shoe has seen 3 to 5 months of daily use. The heel has been resoled, though clumsily, and by a cobbler, likely not from London." "Out of town?" "Exactly. The nails used in the repair are brass, slightly flattened at the head, common in workshops near Leeds or perhaps Durham. Now, observe the faint trace of what appears to be sand, light grey, fine-grained, uncommon in London soil. It suggests the wearer walked recently along a coastline, or perhaps a riverbank in the north." I shook my head. "You deduced all that from a single shoe?" He allowed himself a small smile. "No, Watson, I deduced more, but I thought I might give you time to catch up." At that moment, a knock came at the door. It was Lestrade. He entered, his face pale and wind-chapped, the brim of his hat still glistening with drizzle. "Holmes," he began without preamble, "we've a situation off Rathbone Place. A young woman found dead in a boarding room. No sign of violence, no indication of forced entry, no possessions, no papers, except for one thing." He looked down. She was wearing mismatched shoes. Holmes lifted the shoe from the table and held it up. Lestrade's eyes widened. "That's the one." "I thought as much," Holmes murmured. "Then our visitor this morning was no lunatic after all." "I beg your pardon?" Lestrade looked baffled. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, would you kindly bring my coat? We're going out." As we prepared to leave, Holmes explained further. A woman arrives wearing one shoe from the deceased and one of her own, deliberately mismatched, and delivers the murder victim's shoe into our hands. That is not coincidence, Inspector. That is a signal. To whom? To me. We followed Lestrade through the damp morning streets, our cab rattling southward through Bloomsbury. As we neared Rathbone Place, Holmes grew more silent, his eyes fixed not on any one point but clearly racing ahead through unseen possibilities. The boarding house was an unremarkable structure, a narrow three-story affair with peeling green paint and soot-caked windows. A constable stood guard at the entrance. Inside, the landlady, a stout and nervous woman named Mrs. Welby, led us up a creaking staircase to the second floor. "She took the room under the name Miss Glover," she whispered. "Quiet thing. Paid 2 weeks in advance. No luggage but a carpet bag. Hardly left the room except in the evenings." The room itself was sparse. A narrow bed, a washstand, a chair, and a cracked mirror above the fireplace. On the floor lay the young woman, pale and still, as though sleep had taken her in mid-breath. She could not have been more than 25. Holmes knelt beside the body. Her face was serene, no bruising, no blood. Her hands rested palm up, but it was the shoes that drew his attention. On her left foot, a black walking shoe, matte leather, newly tied. On her right foot, a similar design but unmistakably smaller and shinier, with a narrow cut and a pointed toe. "Not a pair," Holmes whispered, "and not her own." He carefully removed both shoes and examined the soles. Then he glanced at the washstand and smiled faintly. "What is it?" I asked. He pointed. "A soap dish, unused." I frowned. "She hadn't washed?" "Or," Holmes said, "she had no need to. She came here to die." Lestrade made a scoffing sound. "You think this was suicide?" Holmes shook his head. "Number. But I think she believed she wouldn't leave this room. That much is certain." He stood and walked to the fireplace. There, tucked behind the edge of the mirror's frame, he retrieved a folded paper. It read only 5 words, scrawled in a neat, hurried hand. "Ask who wore the other." Holmes handed it to me. She was trying to send a message. The mismatched shoes are not random, they're a key. "A key to what?" I asked. Holmes turned slowly. "To the identity of her killer." He paused. "And to something far deeper than murder. This is no crime of passion, Watson. This is theatre." Lestrade crossed his arms. "You're saying the killer wanted us to find her like this?" "No," Holmes said softly. "The victim did." And with that, he turned back to the lifeless form on the floor and said, almost to himself, "What did you know, Miss Glover? And who did you think would listen?" Chapter 2. A quiet guest in the rain. The streets outside the boarding house were awash in the grey hush of a London drizzle, fine and steady. Holmes, ever impervious to the damp, stood under the crumbling lintel of the doorway, his coat clinging to his frame, and his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the horse-drawn carriages and morning foot traffic. I watched his expression, not blank but deeply still, as though some unseen thread were being drawn taut behind his brow. He spoke at last. "Watson, you'll recall the woman who visited us this morning. Can you describe her posture?" I thought back. Nervous, but not disoriented. Her hands trembled slightly when she placed the shoe on your table. She kept her face downcast and spoke no more than a sentence. "She walked with an even gait?" "I believe so, yes." Holmes nodded, satisfied. "Then she was not the woman found upstairs." Lestrade frowned. "You're certain of that?" "Completely. The body we've seen lies in a state of unnatural repose, and though she shares the shoe size and likely age of the visitor, she lacks the small telltale tremor that marked the other's hand. One of them came in search of help. The other left a message in silence. Lestrade tugged at his collar, clearly frustrated. Then who the devil was she? Holmes turned to him sharply. The living woman who came to us was the key witness, not the victim. The victim used her final moments to set up a message, one that depends on our understanding of both their identities. We rode in silence back to Baker Street, the rattle of the cab's wheels a faint rhythm beneath the misted glass. Holmes had gone deep within himself, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes half-lidded but alert. Only when we had reached the familiar hearth and I placed a fresh cup of tea before him did he speak again. "I would have you write down everything, Watson. Every detail you recall of the woman's entrance. How she opened the door, the inflection in her voice, her movements, what she touched and what she avoided." I obliged. The memory was clear in my mind, sharpened now by context. She had entered swiftly, too swiftly for someone uncertain of her place. She had placed the shoe with a kind of reverence, not haste. And she had not looked Holmes in the eye, though she clearly knew him. Most telling of all, she had glanced, not nervously but with quiet deliberation, at the violin resting near the bookcase. Holmes caught that last note with interest. The violin? She stared at it for a moment, then turned away. He rose, pacing. An artist, then, or someone who valued music. Perhaps it reminded her of something, or someone. We were interrupted by the arrival of a telegram. Holmes tore it open and read in silence. Then, he passed it to me. It was from Lestrade, to Sherlock Holmes, Baker Street. Autopsy complete. No signs of strangulation, poison, or internal trauma. Cause of death still undetermined. Body to be held for additional testing. Found traces of salt in hairline and on sleeve cuffs. Lestrade. Holmes tapped his finger against the last sentence. Salt. Interesting. Perhaps from the coastal air? I offered. You did suggest she may have walked by a riverbank or seafront. Perhaps, Holmes murmured, but I suspect the salt was not environmental, it was intentional. Sprinkled by the victim herself, or by someone else. Either way, its placement, hairline and cuffs, suggests a ritual, something symbolic. This was Holmes at his most dangerous, when symbols, psychology, and physical evidence converged in his mind like pieces of a game only he could see. We spent the remainder of the afternoon indoors, Holmes poring over maps of the northern rail lines, cross-referencing them with recent papers. I assisted where I could, though he required little. By evening the fog had thickened, and I had nearly given up hope of fresh leads when the bell rang downstairs. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door. "There's a young gentleman here to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says he has information about the girl in Fitzrovia." Holmes stood at once. "Show him in." The visitor was no more than 19, a narrow, pale-faced lad with hollow cheeks and ink-stained fingers. He wore a faded brown coat with a missing button and clutched a rolled piece of canvas under one arm. "You are Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his voice thin. "I am. My name's Eli Thorne. I think I know who the girl was." Holmes gestured for him to sit. "Take your time, Mr. Thorne." The boy sat, the canvas clutched tighter now. I didn't know her well, only from a workshop in Camden Town. I'm a lithographer's apprentice. She'd come sometimes on Sundays to sketch. Always alone. Never gave a name, but she liked to draw shoes. Only shoes. Lined them up on the table like dancers. He unrolled the canvas and revealed a series of fine pencil sketches, dozens of women's shoes, drawn with obsessive precision, some ordinary, some exquisite. But one, unmistakably, matched the black leather shoe Holmes had examined earlier. Holmes leaned forward. Did she ever say where she came from? Number. But she once dropped a note. I found it on the floor after she left. He handed it over. The paper was torn and faintly marked. Holmes examined it in silence. The note read only this: "He thinks I don't remember. But I do. Every step, even the one he made me change." Holmes looked up sharply. "Mr. Thorne, you've done more than you know." The boy looked confused. "What does it mean?" "It means," Holmes said, standing, "that this girl was not running from something. She was retracing it." And with that, he returned to the window, where the gaslight blurred against the glass and the rain whispered like footsteps on the sill. Behind us, the mismatched shoe still sat quietly on the desk, mute, but no longer voiceless. Chapter 3. The Step That Should Not Be There. The following morning broke pale and windless, the streets washed clean by a night of rain that had since vanished without a trace. At breakfast, Holmes remained unusually silent, sipping his tea without so much as a glance at the paper I had left folded beside his plate. When he finally stirred, it was to retrieve the canvas sketches left by young Eli Thorne the night before. "You observed the shoes closely, Watson," he said at last. "But what about the pattern?" "Pattern?" He laid out 3 of the girl's sketches. "All shoes, yes, but look closer. These are not merely studies in design. They are not symmetrical." I leaned in. He was right. Each pair contained a subtle difference between the left and right foot, a difference in height, heel angle, or lace orientation. One pair even featured 2 left shoes drawn side by side. "She was documenting a flaw," Holmes murmured. "Or perhaps a correction." I shook my head. "You believe she was drawing memories?" "More than memories, evidence. These were not idealized forms, Watson. They are reconstructions." He rose abruptly. "Come, we must visit Camden Town." We arrived at the lithography workshop just before 10, a modest establishment tucked between a stationer's and a clock repairer's. It bore the faded signage of Glint and Haverford, printers and stonework for the trade. A young man, barely 25 and missing 2 fingers from his left hand, greeted us from behind the counter. His name was Corbin Haverford. "Yes, I remember the girl," he said when Holmes presented the sketch. "Never gave a full name, said she only needed a quiet place to draw, paid in coin, brought her own paper but borrowed our pencils." "Did she ever speak of shoes?" Holmes asked. Corbin gave a puzzled nod. "That's all she ever drew. We joked once that she must be training to be a cobbler. I even asked her why shoes, and she said, what was it now?" He frowned, thinking. She said, "Because I couldn't speak the truth, so I walked it instead." Holmes's expression sharpened. "And this?" He showed the mismatched shoe once again. Corbin nodded. "That one, I recall. She drew it with such care, and after she finished, she stared at it for minutes, like it might answer her. Then she tore the page in half and left." "Tore it?" "Yes. I offered to tape it, but she refused. Said one shoe had already betrayed her, whatever that meant." We left shortly after, Holmes deep in thought once more, the wheels in his mind clearly grinding toward something vital. I could see it in the quickening of his steps, the way his fingers twitched against the handle of his cane, even when it was not required. "What are you thinking, Holmes?" I finally asked, as we passed through Mornington Crescent. "That the girl left her trail in silence. not because she was unable to speak, but because she knew we would not believe her if she did. He paused at the corner of Oakley Street. There is someone missing from this narrative, Watson. Someone she never named. The person who taught her to walk differently. The one who made her change a step. And what are we to do? We find the person who watched her walk. That afternoon, Holmes sent telegrams to 4 institutions, 2 boarding schools, a private clinic for the rehabilitation of injured children, and a women's shelter in Brighton. When I asked why, he only said, because those are the places where a changed gait is most often corrected, especially when imposed by others. By evening, a reply came from the Brighton shelter. Miss Unknown arrived 3 years ago, quiet, limped slightly on left foot. Said she was pushed down a staircase at 6 years old, never named family, sketched constantly, vanished one morning without a word. Mrs. E. Dunley, house matron. Holmes folded the telegram slowly. There's our shadow. The staircase incident? I asked. Could that be connected to the mismatched step? It is the mismatched step, Watson. That fall gave her a limp. A small one, yes, but permanent. She was forced to relearn balance, to adjust her walk, but someone in her life demanded she hide it. But who? I suspect someone who claimed to love her, or protect her, but really, someone who was hiding her. A knock came at the door. This time it was not Lestrade. A woman stood there, heavily veiled and wearing a travelling cloak darkened by fog. She held a parasol and a pair of gloves, both of which trembled in her hands. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "you sent for me." He inclined his head. "Miss Marianne Calder, I presume?" She nodded. "Please." Holmes gestured to the chair. "You once ran a finishing school near Whitby, did you not?" "Yes," she said, settling into the seat. "Until the funds ran dry. What is this about?" Holmes retrieved one of the sketches from the mantel. "Do you recognize this shoe?" Her face went pale. "Where did you get that?" "It was drawn by a girl who once attended your school. A girl you knew not as a student, but as a secret." She rose quickly. "I don't know what you mean." "You took her in under a different name," Holmes continued, voice calm. "She wasn't enrolled. She was hidden, perhaps by a relative, perhaps by someone seeking to keep her from public record." "Enough," she snapped. "If this is about Eleanor, then I will say nothing. Not now, not ever." "She is dead," Holmes said quietly. Marianne froze. "Found alone in a boarding house in Fitzrovia, wearing 2 different shoes. One belonged to her. The other, I believe, to the life she fled." For several seconds there was only the sound of the clock on the mantel ticking, soft and insistent. Then Marianne Calder sat back down, and her voice, when it returned, was broken. "I warned them. I said secrets rot if left buried. I said children are not stones to be placed beneath carpets. But they wouldn't listen. And now she's gone." "Who was hiding her?" Holmes asked. She stared into her gloves. "Her uncle," she whispered. "A man who lost his fortune and took her inheritance to stay afloat. He said she'd been orphaned, that she was mad, that no one would miss her." "What was his name?" "Gregor Ashcroft." Holmes turned slowly to me. "That," he said, "is a name we've heard before." Chapter 4. The Gathering Shadows of Ashcroft. Even before the door had shut behind Marianne Calder, Holmes was already moving. He crossed the room in 3 strides, retrieved a thick ledger from the bottom shelf of his cabinet, and opened it with the kind of precision that suggests not only familiarity, but anticipation. He stopped at the name Gregor Ashcroft. "You've encountered him before?" I asked, setting aside my notes. Twice, Holmes replied, his fingers tapping the page. Once in a matter involving railway contracts and embezzlement, a case that never reached the courts but saw several government files quietly sealed. And once in relation to the disappearance of a nursemaid from Surrey in 1886. You suspected him then? I suspected his influence, not his presence. Ashcroft never dirtied his hands directly. He operated through whispers and money, both harder to trace than footprints. He closed the ledger with a snap. If Marianne Calder is to be believed, then the girl we are tracking was placed under his guardianship, or what passed for it, hidden in institutions, kept off legal registries and paid for in quiet sums. But something changed. She fled. And now, she is dead. I could feel a tension rising in Holmes, subtle but growing, a current beneath still water. You think Ashcroft followed her? I asked. I think Ashcroft believed he had silenced her years ago, and when he discovered she had resurfaced, he took no chances. But it may not have been he who delivered the final blow. That, Holmes said, pacing slowly now, is what we must determine. Was the death reactive or preventative? That evening Lestrade arrived, rain-slicked and sour-faced. You've dragged me into another storm, Holmes, he grumbled. You're chasing a ghost on the basis of a sketch and a shoe. A sketch, a shoe, Holmes said calmly, and now a name, Gregor Ashcroft. Lestrade paused. Ashcroft. That name circled my desk more times than I can count, but nothing ever sticks. Because nothing is ever allowed to, Holmes replied. Tell me, has Scotland Yard ever questioned the abrupt closing of two girls' homes in Sussex in the same year Ashcroft's name appeared in inheritance disputes? Lestrade's brow darkened. You're suggesting a pattern? I'm suggesting a structure, Holmes corrected. He doesn't erase people, he replaces them. Lestrade leaned forward. And this girl? What's she to him? An inconvenient heir, possibly his niece, perhaps even the rightful beneficiary of his estate, or the estate he stole. Either way, she was worth hiding. Lestrade considered. And now? She resurfaced, not with a lawyer or a constable, but with a sketch pad and a limp. Holmes crossed to the fireplace and lit a fresh match. She came to me, Lestrade. That means she no longer trusted the law to keep her alive. For a moment, there was only the quiet flare of flame. Lestrade stood. What do you need? A list of all properties owned by Ashcroft, directly or indirectly, especially rentals under shell companies. I'll see what I can shake loose. As Lestrade left, Holmes turned to me. Come, Watson, we've somewhere to be. Where? To the last place she fled before dying, the boarding house. We arrived in Fitzrovia by lantern light, the building quiet under the cloak of evening. Holmes greeted the landlady, a nervous woman named Mrs. Penley, with uncharacteristic warmth. She never gave her name, the woman insisted as she led us up the stairs. Paid a week in advance, never asked for breakfast, never left during the day, only went out at night. When was the last time you saw her? 3 nights ago. She asked if I'd heard of Albion Square. I said no. She thanked me, and that was it. Holmes glanced at me as we reached the top landing. Note that, Watson, Albion Square. The room itself was stark, a narrow bed, a cracked basin, a single window facing an alley. Holmes moved through the space like a man among ruins. He tapped lightly at the floorboards, checked the windowsill, sniffed the edge of the pillow. Then he paused. Watson, he said, crouching. There, just beneath the wardrobe, he drew forth a folded strip of coarse paper. He opened it. This time, there were no sketches, just a line written in smudged pencil. My right step still doesn't match. He told me to hide it. I made it louder. Holmes exhaled slowly. She was tracing her life through motion, each shoe, each altered step, a code. And the phrase, made it louder. She was no longer hiding her limp. She was using it, like a signature. He stood, looking at the floor. Then, with a sudden motion, he pulled back the small threadbare rug. There, on the wood beneath, was a line of chalk, faint but deliberate. 7 steps, each marked with a shoe's heel imprint, all left-footed. The final one bore a faint X. She was reenacting it, Holmes said softly. The fall, the lie, and perhaps the truth. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Penley appeared again. "Telegram for you, sir." Holmes took it, eyes flicking over the words. "Gregor Ashcroft owns property in Albion Square, purchased 6 years ago. Resides there privately. Lestrade." Holmes smiled faintly. "Watson," he said, "our ghost has a chimney." And with that we were off again. Into the fog, into the dark, into the shadow of a man whose footprints were invisible. Unless you knew where to step, Chapter 5. The Man Who Bought Silence. The fog was thick in Albion Square, clinging to the cobblestones like smoke from some slow-burning fire no one could locate. The street itself was narrow and quiet, a forgotten spur just off the better-trafficked Gray's Inn Road. Even the lamps seemed reluctant to illuminate the place. Their glow pooled at the base of the iron posts, failing to reach the curtained windows of the homes that lined either side. Number 14 stood out not by ornament or grandeur, but by something subtler. Stillness. Not a curtain moved. No smoke drifted from its chimney. It did not seem vacant, only untouched. Holmes studied it with that narrow squint he reserved for objects he already suspected of lying. "He lives here?" I asked. "He owns it," Holmes corrected. "Whether he lives here remains to be seen." He rapped twice on the black door. No answer. He rapped again, sharper. Still nothing. Then Holmes stepped back and, without a word, circled to the alley that ran behind the building. I followed, boots echoing off the stones. He tested the garden gate. Locked. "Watson, your blade." I produced my pocket knife, and Holmes worked the latch with deft precision. The gate clicked open, revealing a small rear garden gone to seed. Overgrown ivy scaled the back wall. A rusted water pump leaned at an angle near the back steps. Holmes led the way. At the door, he paused again. Then, with a gentle twist of the knob, unlocked. It opened inward with a soft creak. We entered. The interior was hushed. Not the hush of absence, but of presence concealed. The air smelled faintly of pipe smoke and something floral, lavender perhaps, overpowering and artificial. Holmes moved swiftly, scanning without touching. A pair of slippers by the hearth, a walking stick by the sideboard, a half-empty glass of port on the mantel. "He's here," Holmes whispered, or was. We moved from room to room, passing through what seemed more a curated museum than a home. Portraits with the eyes scratched out, books arranged alphabetically, all spines facing inward. A bureau with a child's bracelet in a drawer, tucked under tax receipts. On the top floor, we found the study. And in the study, we found the man. Gregor Ashcroft was seated in a high-backed leather chair, one leg crossed neatly over the other. His grey hair was oiled and parted, his moustache waxed to points. He looked up as we entered, unsurprised. "You took your time," he said. Holmes regarded him without blinking. "I find footsteps more reliable than invitations." Ashcroft gave a tight smile. "So, to what do I owe the pleasure? Have the Board of Trade finally grown a conscience?" "No," said Holmes. "This concerns a girl, One who wore mismatched shoes. Ashcroft's expression twitched, just for a moment. You'll need to be more specific. Her name was Eleanor, Holmes continued, stepping forward. But you may have known her as the arrangement, hidden in schools, shuffled between homes, silenced by money and fear. Until recently, when she began walking differently. I see. Ashcroft rose and poured himself a fresh glass of port, motioning with practiced grace. Would you like a drink? Number. Ashcroft sipped, savouring it. And what exactly are you accusing me of, Mr. Holmes? Nothing. Not yet, Holmes said. But I have questions. Ashcroft sat again, unbothered. Then ask them. Holmes stepped to the window, speaking as he looked out. When did you last see her? Ashcroft didn't answer immediately. 7 years ago, she was 12, unmanageable. The doctors warned me she had sensitivities. She had a limp, Holmes corrected. Ashcroft waved his hand. Yes, from a fall. Tragic business. She never quite recovered. She remembered it, though, Holmes said softly. Every step. She sketched it out, even reenacted it on floorboards before she died. That made Ashcroft pause just slightly. I'm told she asked after Albion Square before her death, Holmes continued. Did she come here? I wouldn't know. Did you know she was in London? Ashcroft stared at the fire, not answering. She was found in Fitzrovia, I said. Dead, mismatched shoes. One shoe was hers, the other may well have been yours. Ashcroft looked up sharply. That's absurd. Is it? Holmes turned now, fully facing him. Your gait is uneven, slight drag on the right leg, old injury, but your shoes, polished uniform, mask the difference. She noticed. She mimicked it. She left a clue. Ashcroft stood. You've no warrant, no proof, just sketches and supposition. And guilt, Holmes said quietly, which you are sweating through quite visibly. Ashcroft approached, now more animated. You have no idea what you're stirring, Holmes. That girl was unstable, dangerous. She believed things that never happened. She believed in the truth, Holmes replied, even if no one else would speak it. Ashcroft's composure slipped. She threatened to expose me after all I did, after everything I protected her from. She turned on me like a stray mutt. You weren't protecting her, Holmes said coldly. You were protecting yourself. There was silence. Then Holmes moved toward the bookshelf and withdrew a single volume, a treatise on balance and rehabilitation in the developing child. He opened it. Inside, a folded letter. Holmes read aloud. To whom it may concern, my name is Eleanor. If anything happens to me, this man, Gregor Ashcroft, must be held accountable. He made me walk wrong. He said no one would believe me if I walked like myself. So I am writing it down now, while I still can. The truth is in my steps. Ashcroft lunged forward, but Holmes had already stepped back. Lestrade entered a moment later, flanked by 2 constables. You were right, Lestrade muttered. We found financial records, payoffs, silent trusts, more than enough. Ashcroft said nothing as they cuffed him. He didn't protest, didn't shout. He only muttered as he passed us. She couldn't even walk in a straight line. Holmes watched him go. No, he said softly. She walked in a circle, one that came back to you. And then, turning to me, Holmes whispered, It's time to follow her steps one more time. Chapter 6. The Silent Step That Didn't Fit. It was late when we returned to Baker Street. The fog had thinned, and the streets were beginning to shimmer with the low silver of gaslight and wet stone. Holmes had not spoken since leaving Albion Square, but I could see the storm gathering behind his silence. He did not play his violin. He did not light a pipe. He merely sat, fingertips pressed together, staring down at Eleanor's folded letter as if it might, if stared at long enough, reveal one more hidden name. "You have him," I said finally. "Ashcroft." Holmes did not look up. "I have a man," he murmured. "Not the one." I sat forward. He admitted enough. The ledger, the hush payments. He orchestrated her disappearance. "Yes," Holmes said, "but not her death." I blinked. "You don't believe he killed her?" Holmes shook his head. "Number A man like Ashcroft preserves his distance. He hides behind layers. He would not risk direct exposure. He did not follow her to Fitzrovia. He did not draw the chalk marks beneath the rug. And he did not put on mismatched shoes." He stood abruptly, crossing to his desk. From the bottom drawer, he produced the mismatched shoes, both recovered from the crime scene and sent to Baker Street earlier that morning for inspection. He set them side by side on the rug. "Watson, look again. What do you see?" "One woman's shoe," I said slowly, "and one man's." Holmes nodded. "And yet both are scuffed on the outer heel." I frowned. "From dragging. But Eleanor only limped on one side." "Precisely. She wore one of her own shoes, left foot, and someone else's, right. But why?" "She was sending a message," Holmes murmured. "One I nearly missed." He knelt beside the shoes. She was reenacting someone else's walk, someone who mirrored her gait. I felt a chill rise. Someone who limped like her. On the opposite side, Holmes met my gaze. It wasn't mimicry, it was symmetry. I stood, beginning to pace now. So the mismatched shoes weren't a mistake. They were deliberate. A code. Holmes gestured toward the bookshelf. "Retrieve the ledger, Watson. The one from her sketches." I did. He flipped it open, landing on one of the rougher, more chaotic pages. A pair of mirrored outlines, left and right, drawn in ink. Within each, she had written small words, barely legible. Limp, drag, echo. "An echo," Holmes said, tapping the word. She saw someone following her, not with force, but in rhythm, someone who mirrored her injury, perhaps even faked it, someone she came to fear. I swallowed. "But who?" Holmes tapped the edge of his mouth with a finger. She was alone in the boarding house. The landlady saw no one, and yet she was frightened. She began walking her story into the floor, drawing signs, hiding them. He turned toward the fire and fell quiet. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and firm. "Someone was watching her. You think she was murdered? I think someone made certain she would not speak." A knock at the door interrupted us. It was Lestrade, this time without fanfare. "She's gone," he said grimly. "Who?" Holmes asked. "Marianne Calder. Vanished. Her lodging house packed up this morning, left no forwarding address." My mind reeled. "But she was the one who came to us." Lestrade nodded. "Perhaps too conveniently. Perhaps to steer the story in a direction we'd find useful, but not too useful." Holmes turned away. "And yet, she gave us Ashcroft." "She gave us a fall guy," Lestrade replied. "A guilty man, yes, but not the one holding the knife." Holmes sat down hard. "We must find her." "I'll put out alerts," Lestrade promised. "But if she's half as clever as you say, she'll have changed names by nightfall." Holmes remained silent after the inspector left. He did not move for nearly an hour. Then suddenly he stood, pulled on his coat, and motioned to me. "We go to the morgue." "The morgue? There's one more story Eleanor left behind," he said. "One we didn't hear." At the police morgue, the assistant recognized Holmes immediately and admitted us without delay. "She's still there," he said. "No one's claimed her." The room was cold and sterile, the bodies under white sheets like books, waiting to be reopened. Holmes approached the slab quietly and drew back the cloth. Eleanor lay as I had last seen her, but in this light, under Holmes's careful gaze, something changed. She wasn't pushed, Holmes said softly. I blinked. What? She wasn't pushed, he repeated. Look at the angle of the bruises. Look at the way her nails are broken, not from clawing outward, but from gripping. You mean... She fell, Holmes whispered, or rather, let herself fall. I staggered back. You think she took her own life? Number. I think she chose the ending, rather than risk someone else choosing it for her. He leaned in closer, but even in that moment, she left us something. He reached to her wrist. Beneath the hospital band, he pulled gently at a fraying bracelet, child-sized, worn thin with age. Inside, engraved in small copper letters, CAI felt the air still. Not Eleanor, Holmes murmured. Charlotte Ashcroft. She was the heir. Holmes nodded, which means Marianne wasn't just a witness, she was a rival. He looked at me with quiet fire in his eyes. And Watson, she may not be done yet. Chapter 7. The Inheritance That Vanished Twice. The revelation struck like a sudden gust in an otherwise still room. Charlotte Ashcroft, not Eleanor, not a faceless ward, but the missing heir of a crumbling fortune, rendered invisible not by death but by design. Her name had been buried, her limp suppressed, her bloodline silenced, and now, at last, her voice had returned, but only through the worn copper letters hidden on her wrist. Holmes remained standing beside the cold slab for a long while, one hand gently cradling the broken bracelet as if it were made of something far more delicate than copper. She signed her drawings as Eleanor, I said softly. A name given to her, Holmes murmured, or one she chose. Perhaps it felt safer than claiming her birthright. I took a breath. Marianne Calder knew. She must have, Holmes replied. And if she knew Charlotte's true identity, she knew exactly what would happen should the truth emerge. She stood to lose everything. Holmes gave a short nod. Or gain everything, if Charlotte were removed. The logic was chilling, but undeniable. I turned away from the table, letting the silence stretch. The cold, the smell of chemicals, the quiet hum of distant lanterns, it all pressed on me with new weight. Holmes, I said after a moment, we still don't know how Marianne found us. Holmes turned sharply. Correct. Which means we need to ask the only question that truly matters now. He stepped into his coat, fastening it with renewed purpose. Why come to us at all? Why risk attention? I followed him out into the street. The air was dense again, low-hanging mist, thick as wool, blurring the outlines of passers-by and lanterns alike. Baker Street was a blur of orange glows and shuffling silhouettes. Back inside, Holmes immediately turned to the ledger of names, Charlotte's final notebook. He opened it near the center, where the sketches shifted from legs and footprints to windows, birds, symbols, and faces. One sketch stood out. A woman seated at a writing desk, her head turned slightly to the left. A partial name was scrawled underneath. Marianne, I guessed. Holmes nodded. She drew her, but notice, her mouth is erased. I looked again. The lines of the jaw and neck were present, but the lips, chin, and expression had been carefully rubbed out. She feared her, Holmes said, tapping the paper. Feared her words most of all. But if Marianne meant her harm, I asked, why not kill her sooner? Holmes looked up. Because Marianne didn't know she remembered. Not until. Charlotte returned to Albion Square. His eyes lit with understanding. She came back for the bracelet, something sentimental, hidden in a place Ashcroft would never look. "Number 14, I whispered. Holmes smiled faintly. She took back her name, and then the steps began. That evening, we visited the offices of Emeridge and Bellamy, solicitors. A discreet firm nestled behind Lincoln's Inn Fields, it was known more for managing family wealth than chasing justice. We were met by Mr. Bellamy himself, a thin, pale man with precise manners and a quill that never left his fingers. "You were the executor of Mr. Gregor Ashcroft's estate," Holmes said plainly. Bellamy nodded. "I remain so." "Tell me," Holmes asked, "did Ashcroft update his will in the last 12 months? Bellamy's face twitched with professional restraint. "May I ask why?" Holmes said nothing. He merely held up the copper bracelet. Bellamy stiffened. His quill stopped mid-air. "Where did you find that?" Holmes stepped forward. "In the morgue, on the wrist of the girl you once knew as Charlotte Ashcroft." The solicitor's composure splintered. "Good God." "You knew she was alive," Holmes said, "or suspected it." Bellamy sat slowly, colour draining from his cheeks. "I wasn't sure. Years ago there was a medical incident, a letter from a clinic in Geneva." Then silence. Holmes nodded. "And yet, in the absence of a death certificate, the estate could not be passed on." Bellamy hesitated. "That's not entirely true. The assets were placed in trust. Marianne Calder was named interim caretaker. She petitioned for full rights last month." Holmes's voice was sharp now. "Which she would have received, had Charlotte not resurfaced." Bellamy swallowed. "And now she's gone." Holmes leaned over the desk. "Where was Marianne last seen?" Bellamy glanced at a ledger. "A train to Dover, 2 days ago." I frowned. "France?" "Possibly," Holmes said, "or somewhere harder to trace." But Holmes was already pocketing the ledger. "She won't go far. Not until she's certain no one else knows." He turned to me. "Which means we force her hand." That night, Holmes did something I rarely saw him do. He called in a favour. A small ad appeared in the Morning Post the next day, nothing dramatic. Just a short paragraph tucked between announcements of births and museum lectures. "Missing heir located. A young woman, Charlotte A., long thought deceased, has been found in London and is expected to reclaim her family's estate. Solicitor Bellamy confirms all claims are in order. Those with objections must present evidence by week's end." I raised my brow. "A bluff?" "Not entirely," Holmes said. "She was the heir. Now, we see who feels brave enough to dispute it." He paced as he spoke. "Marianne is clever. She won't contact Bellamy, but she may contact the only people left who can still change the story." He looked at me. "Us." We waited. 2 days passed. Then, just after dusk on the 3rd day, a letter arrived, unmarked, unsealed and folded in half. Inside, a single line. "Meet me where she walked alone." Holmes read it once. "She's coming to finish the lie." He turned, already reaching for his coat. "And Watson, this time, we make her walk straight into the truth." Chapter 8. Where she walked alone. The evening air was thin and sharp, a scent of rain hovering just beyond the rooftops. Holmes and I stood at the edge of Albion Square once more, but the place felt different now, heavier somehow, as though the truth had begun to stain the cobblestones. "Where she walked alone," Holmes repeated, his voice soft, nearly reverent. "A phrase meant to guide us, but more than that, to haunt us." "She could have meant the square itself," I offered. Holmes shook his head. "That's where Charlotte was found, but the phrase suggests a memory, not a crime scene. Somewhere familiar, somewhere private." We began to walk. Holmes moved quickly, leading us not back to number 14 but past it, turning sharply into a narrow alley that wound behind the row houses. The passage was tight, brick-lined and wet underfoot, filled with the faint hum of gas pipes and the rustle of paper trash. At the end stood a gate, rusted, half-hinged. Beyond it, a small garden, long overgrown with lichen-stained benches and iron trellises warped by time. One lamppost leaned over the space like a sleepy sentinel, its light barely holding back the gloom. "She walked here," Holmes murmured. He stepped through the gate, almost cautiously, and knelt beside a patch of flattened ivy. There, half buried in mud, lay the imprint of a shoe, small, pointed, and unmistakably feminine. "One of hers," Holmes said. "Recent." I crouched beside him. "Why return?" "She needed solitude," Holmes replied. "Somewhere no one would follow, but someone did." His gaze drifted upward. Across the back wall of the garden stood a row of narrow windows, mostly basement-level rooms and servant quarters from the adjoining houses, and from one of them, very faintly, a flicker of light. Holmes straightened. "Number 12. We entered the building through a tradesman's door and descended 2 flights into the cellar flats. The halls smelled of burnt coal and boiled onions, but the air shifted as we neared the end. The last door on the right, painted a dull grey, stood ajar. Holmes paused, then pushed it open. Inside was a room sparsely furnished, a table, 2 chairs, a stove, and a trunk. A curtain divided the space. On the table sat a single candle in a cracked glass holder, and in the chair by the window, Marianne Calder. She didn't rise. "I wondered if it would be you," she said. Her voice was flat, not defeated, not angry, just spent. Holmes said nothing. He crossed to the opposite chair and sat, folding his hands atop the table. Watson and I remained near the door. "You saw the notice," Holmes said. Marianne nodded once. "You always did like performances. You preferred private theatres." She glanced at the trunk. "Was it you who found the bracelet?" "Yes." "I thought she'd burned it." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "But you hoped she hadn't." Silence. Then, "I thought I had more time." Holmes tapped his finger against the wood once. Time for what? To disappear, or to rewrite her story? Marianne didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a crumpled envelope. She slid it across the table. Holmes opened it. Inside was a letter, faded but unmistakably written in Charlotte's hand. "To whom it may concern, if this is found, I am Charlotte Ashcroft, daughter of Gregor Ashcroft, presumed dead but very much alive. I lived under other names, but I remember now. I remember my shoes. I remember her. If I do not live to speak, this letter is my witness." At the bottom, her signature. Holmes exhaled slowly. "Why bring this now?" "Because I'm tired," Marianne said, "and because I loved her." Holmes did not flinch. "Yet you betrayed her." "She was going to expose him," Marianne whispered. "Ashcroft. She came back to London furious. I tried to protect her, but he didn't want her to speak, not after all these years." "You made her walk alone," Holmes said. "I tried to follow," Marianne replied, "but I couldn't keep up." Holmes looked at her closely. "You followed her gait." Marianne's eyes flashed. "Because I remembered. Every step, every limp, every time she helped me stand when we were children." There was a moment's stillness. "She wasn't afraid of me," Marianne said. "Not at first." "But something changed." "Yes," Marianne whispered. "She remembered everything. And once she did, she stopped looking at me like a sister." Holmes leaned back in the chair. "So you silenced her." "I hid her," Marianne corrected. It was Ashcroft who silenced her. I only tried to delay the inevitable. Holmes's face was unreadable. She trusted you, he said at last, even at the end. I know. And now? Marianne gestured toward the letter. You have what you need. Let them know. Let the solicitors split the estate. I don't care. Holmes stood. But you'll vanish again. No, she said quietly. I'll stay, whatever happens. I stepped forward. Why now? She looked out the window. Because I saw her ghost in the garden last night. Not a vision, a memory. And I thought, she deserves better. Holmes turned to me. Fetch Lestrade. And as I did, I heard him say, so softly it might have been to no one, she walked alone, but not unseen. Chapter 9. The Second Silence. By the time I returned with Inspector Lestrade in tow, the cellar room was still. Marianne Calder remained at the window, unmoving, her expression unreadable beneath the dim flicker of the candle. Holmes did not look up as we entered. I trust you've brought handcuffs, he said without ceremony. Lestrade sniffed, annoyed at being summoned so late. But at the sight of Marianne he straightened, instantly sensing the gravity of the moment. What's this about then? He asked gruffly. Holmes passed him the letter, Charlotte's final testament. Lestrade read it, his brows slowly rising. You're saying this woman murdered her? No, Holmes said. She buried her. But the man responsible for the crime is already dead. Gregor Ashcroft. Lestrade blinked. Then what charge am I pressing here? Holmes's voice was quiet but firm. Fraud, concealment of a body, and obstruction of justice. Marianne did not protest. She rose slowly, placed her hands on the table, and waited. It was one of the most subdued arrests I have ever witnessed. Lestrade said little. He placed the cuffs on her gently, almost awkwardly, as though dealing with a figure out of a dream rather than a criminal. Marianne followed him without resistance, pausing only to glance once at Holmes. She was the kindest person I've ever known, she said. Holmes gave no reply. Once they had gone, Holmes stood at the table for a long time, staring at the candle stub burning low in its glass holder. She didn't come to us to confess, he murmured. No? I asked, surprised. She came to preserve the ending, he said, to ensure Charlotte's truth outlived her silence. He pocketed the letter again and turned away. The following morning, Baker Street was uncommonly quiet. Even the post arrived late, as though the city itself were uncertain how to resume its usual rhythm. Holmes stood at the window, smoking, his thoughts adrift in the grey fog outside. Something still bothers me, I said. He didn't turn, but I knew he was listening. She claimed she didn't kill Charlotte, I continued. And you believed her. But how do we know? Holmes tapped ash into the tray, because the girl in the morgue had no signs of struggle, no bruising, no trauma. Poison. He shook his head. Nothing found. Then what? He finally looked at me. Grief, he said, or resignation. Charlotte had been erased too many times. Perhaps in the end she simply let go. I said nothing for a while. And the shoes? I asked at last. Why keep mismatched shoes? Holmes turned back to the window. Because that was the part she could control. If she couldn't fix the story they told about her, she could at least wear the ending she chose. I sat back, staring at the floor. She wore them deliberately then. Yes, Holmes said. And she left the others beneath the parlour rug to be found, knowing someone would follow the wrong footsteps first. That afternoon, we returned once more to Albion Square. Number 14 had been locked again, Perhaps by the landlord, or perhaps by some unseen hand ensuring the place remained untouched. But Holmes did not need to enter. Instead, he crossed the garden again, pacing the same path Charlotte once walked. "She came here often," he said, "more than anyone realized." I followed his gaze to the ivy-covered bench. "She waited here," he said, almost to himself. Perhaps she hoped someone would come. Perhaps she believed the garden still remembered her. The wind stirred through the leaves above us. In the silence, I could almost hear the soft scrape of her mismatched heels. Holmes crouched by the edge of the path again. "There's something else," he said. He brushed aside the ivy with careful fingers, revealing something glinting faintly in the dirt, a key. Small, rusted, with a bent tooth. He examined it for a moment. "Not to number 14, he said. "Too old, too narrow." I leaned closer. "A drawer, a box." He looked up, eyes narrowing. "Or a lock she meant to keep from opening." Back at Baker Street, Holmes laid the key beside the bracelet on the mantel. He studied both silently for several minutes. Finally, he spoke. "This wasn't about inheritance, Watson, or even about murder. It was about being remembered correctly." I nodded slowly. "You said she left the shoes for us." Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes, but not just us. She left them for the house. For anyone who might one day pull back the rug." He glanced out the window where the sky was beginning to pale into dusk. She knew someone would walk there, and someone would listen. That night I dreamed of the parlor again, but this time the rug had been rolled away. The floorboards were smooth and open, revealing not a body, but a set of footsteps, chalk outlines, vanishing into the distance. And I followed them. I never caught up. But I was not afraid, because for the first time I understood. The silence was not empty. It was waiting, and someone had finally heard it. Chapter 10. The drawer that never closed rain had begun to fall again over Baker Street by the time Holmes lit the gas lamp and seated himself at his desk. It was nearing midnight, but the energy that sometimes overtook him at crucial junctures in a case had returned. I knew that look. His fingers steepled just below his chin, the glint in his eye sharpened by some half-seen revelation yet to surface. On the table beside him rested the rusted key, still faintly damp from the garden. Beside it, the thin silver bracelet Charlotte had hidden beneath the floorboards. Holmes had not yet spoken a word, but I could sense his thoughts in motion, turning, shifting, peeling away each layer of the enigma with slow precision. "You see the question, Watson," he said at last. "I see several," I replied, not without weariness. He gave the faintest smile. "But only one truly matters now. Why did she leave the bracelet behind?" I blinked. "To be found, surely. As a sign." Holmes shook his head. "But not too easily. It was hidden. Had Marianne not led us to the house, we may never have uncovered it." I considered this. Then not for the police. For someone else? "Indeed. But who?" The question lingered. Holmes reached for the key and held it up against the gaslight, studying the jagged teeth. "This doesn't belong to any modern lock. It's the sort one would find in a writing desk or a vanity." He rose abruptly and crossed the room to the shelves where we kept our most curious relics. Newspaper clippings, bits of evidence never claimed, and Holmes's personal notebooks, each one bound in black, labelled only with a case number and a date. He selected one and began flipping through it. "Ah," he said, tapping the page. The Ashcroft family's former solicitor mentioned an heirloom dressing table, a gift from the matriarch to Charlotte before her supposed disappearance. Walnut, brass fixtures, lockable drawer. "Do you believe it's still in the house?" He gave me a glance. "Let us find out." We arrived at number 14 just after dawn. The building, now abandoned once more, seemed even more hollow in the morning gloom. A thin mist clung to the window panes. The landlord, roused by Holmes's written request and a nominal bribe, had provided access for 1 hour. The house greeted us with its familiar silence. Holmes moved directly to the second floor, where Charlotte had once stayed during her final days. The bedroom was sparse, just a narrow bed, a faded rug, and a dressing table pushed against the far wall. Holmes approached the vanity with a kind of reverence. It was indeed walnut, the brass handles dulled by years of neglect. He knelt and tested the bottom drawer. It stuck slightly, swollen with age, but did not lock. "Not this one," he murmured. He tried the central drawer, locked. With a soft click, he slid the old key into place. It turned. Inside lay a bundle of pages, letters, some torn, others scorched at the edges. Holmes lifted them carefully. His eyes scanned rapidly across the topmost sheets. "They're addressed to no one," he said, but clearly written by Charlotte. I moved beside him. "What do they say?" He read aloud. "I remember now. The orchard, the shoes, the promise she made, that no one would ever speak of it. But I kept them anyway, beneath the parlor rug, just in case I forgot. Marianne says the past is dead, but I hear it breathing. I hear it in the boards at night. I don't think she sleeps when I do. She said it would all go away, but it doesn't. I walk differently now, one heel heavier than the other. I don't think I belong to the ground anymore." Holmes's brow furrowed. "She feared Marianne?" I asked quietly. "Feared, yes, but also loved," Holmes said. "A tragic blend. This is not the language of betrayal, Watson. This is the language of grief, twisted upon itself." He turned the page. "She wrote one final entry," Holmes whispered. "If someone reads this, know that I tried. I tried to return as someone whole, but I am stitched from too many shadows. The shoes do not match, but neither did the stories. That was the only truth." We stood in silence. Then Holmes replaced the pages in the drawer and turned the key once more. "This," he said, "is the heart of the crime." "But there was no murder," I said. "No," Holmes agreed. "Only the slow theft of self, the erasure of a girl's voice bit by bit, until she vanished even to herself." He stepped back from the vanity. "We will return these pages to the solicitor," he said. "Let them speak for her." "And Marianne?" Holmes's eyes darkened. "She wanted control. She dressed Charlotte, steered her, protected her, but at the cost of her identity. She claimed she only wanted to keep her safe, which in her mind meant keeping her silent." We stood at the threshold of the room a moment longer. Then Holmes closed the door behind us with unusual gentleness. And for the first time since this case began, I felt that the house had exhaled, as though at last it had been heard, not solved, not avenged, but listened to, just as Charlotte had always hoped. Chapter 11. The Whisper in the Hall Mirror. The morning after our return from Albion Square, I found Holmes seated by the hearth, a fresh envelope unopened in his lap. The fire had died to embers, and the smoke curled thinly around the frame of the window as if trying to retreat from the cold world outside. A thin trace of ash had settled on the sill. He turned the envelope over once more before finally tearing it open. It was from Lestrade. Holmes read the brief note in silence, then passed it to me. Marianne Calder released on conditional bail. No official charges filed. Solicitor filed a motion of medical exemption, citing prolonged grief and psychological trauma. Scotland Yard declines further inquiry. Case closed. G. Lestrade. I folded the paper carefully. "So that's it then," I said. Holmes didn't respond. His gaze had fixed itself on the small mirror above the mantel, a dull oval of glass bordered in brass. One of the few decorations Mrs. Hudson had permitted when we moved in, and the only one Holmes had never covered with chemical notes or newspaper clippings. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes tilted his head, almost imperceptibly. "She looked at herself often," he said. "Charlotte?" "No," he said, eyes narrowing. "Marianne." He stood abruptly and fetched the key from his drawer, the one we had used at the Ashcroft dressing table. Then he walked to the mirror and stared into it, not at his own reflection, but at the frame, the corners, the minute screws that held it against the wall. I watched him closely. "Holmes, surely you don't think—" But he had already stepped onto the hearth and was running his hand behind the glass. With a soft, metallic click, something shifted. He twisted gently, and the entire frame tilted outward, revealing a narrow hollow behind. From it, Holmes extracted a velvet pouch, no larger than a cigarette case. Inside were photographs. He laid them out on the floor. There were 7 of them, sepia-toned, weathered at the corners. Each one depicted Charlotte at various ages, as a child holding a book, as a young woman standing beside a garden path, as a sullen teenager in a formal dress. But all of them had one thing in common. "They've been altered," I said. Holmes nodded. "Note the shadows here, the brushwork near the mouth. Look closely at the posture, how unnaturally rigid the neck seems." "Doctored?" "No, corrected," he said bitterly. "These were retouched to erase signs of distress, of bruises, perhaps even physical deformity." I looked again, more closely now. In the 3rd photo there was a faint line beneath Charlotte's right eye, something rubbed away, but not wholly gone. "Why hide these?" I asked. "Because they spoke a truth Marianne could not abide," Holmes replied. "She wanted a version of Charlotte she could keep preserved, untouched by suffering." He carefully turned over the last photograph. On the back was a single line, written in an elegant, controlled hand. She was better before she remembered. The silence that followed was oppressive. Holmes stood slowly and returned the photographs to the pouch. "There's a name for that kind of love," he said. "Obsession?" "No," he murmured. "Narrative." I looked at him, puzzled. She wanted a version of the story where Charlotte was saved, where nothing bad had ever happened. That's why she confined her. That's why she erased her discomfort. Not to harm her, but to rewrite her. "But a person isn't a story," I said. Holmes nodded. "Precisely. And that was Marianne's great mistake." He placed the pouch in his desk drawer without locking it. Later that day, I paid a visit to Dr. Aldous Harper, the coroner who had first examined Charlotte's remains. He met me in a small consultation room at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, still smelling faintly of formaldehyde. "I've had a second look," Harper said, lowering his voice. "Something's off." "What do you mean?" He pulled out a chart and tapped the lower right corner. "There was faint bruising on the inner wrist," he said. "Extremely faint, not visible to the naked eye, perhaps a week old at most. Could that be significant?" "It could indicate restraint, someone holding her too tightly, or—" He hesitated. "Or something more forceful. It's not conclusive, but paired with the general malnourishment and stress indicators, well, I'd call it suspicious." I nodded slowly. "Thank you, Doctor. That confirms more than you know." When I returned to Baker Street, Holmes was writing. He had filled nearly half a notebook page in his fine, looping script. Across the top, in bold letters, the case of the mismatched shoes, Observations and Conclusions. He did not look up when I entered. "She wasn't murdered," he said, but she was silenced. I placed Harper's findings beside his notebook. Perhaps not entirely voluntarily. Holmes nodded without surprise. Which means the guilt Marianne carried was not imagined, but carefully rationed. He closed the book. "Watson, do you recall the second shoe? Charlotte's left?" "Yes, slightly too small, worn at the sole." Holmes leaned forward. "It wasn't hers." "What?" "She wore it, yes, but it wasn't made for her foot. The wear suggests an older owner, lighter gait, likely male." He paused. "Charlotte had a brother, did she not?" "Stillborn," I recalled, or so the family claimed. Holmes turned to the fire. "Or hidden," he said, "as she was." That night we both retired late, though Holmes, I suspect, did not sleep at all. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing past the window panes like soft fingertips on a locked drawer. And somewhere far from Baker Street, the truth, uncertain, cracked and worn like old leather, shifted in the dark, waiting for someone else to see it clearly. Chapter 12. The Man Who Wasn't on the Birth Record. The morning after Dr. Harper's report, I found Holmes already dressed, standing by the window, his arms folded behind his back. The air outside was brittle with frost, though the sun had begun to burn it away. A strange hush blanketed the city, the kind that comes before something inevitable. Holmes did not turn when I entered. "I've just sent a telegram to Wiltshire," he said, "to a man who doesn't exist." I blinked. "Pardon?" "A former groundskeeper of the Ashcroft estate, dismissed 16 years ago after an unspecified incident involving the orchard. His name never appeared on the household staff records, paid in cash, no last name listed in the ledger, only a curious monogram, MC. And you think?" "I think he is not a groundskeeper. I think he is Michael Calder." I stiffened. "Charlotte's brother?" Holmes nodded. "Born 2 years before her, vanished from all family records after his 3rd birthday." "I thought he died." "Convenient," Holmes said, turning to me at last. "So many family deaths are." He crossed to his desk and tapped a thin sheaf of papers he had compiled through the night. "Note the discrepancies. The cost of children's shoes doubled for 2 years. The governess's journal, which abruptly stops mentioning the twins in the spring of '62. The physician's report for recurring lung weakness, but no child listed as a patient." "Hidden in plain sight," I murmured. "Or not in sight at all," Holmes replied. By midday, a reply arrived. It was scrawled on torn stationery, the ink faded, the hand unsteady. "Mr. Holmes, if you're asking about her, you already know. Meet me at the 7 Viaduct, just before dusk. Come alone. MC." We reached the 7 Viaduct by late afternoon. A mist had rolled in along the river, and the iron span loomed above like a rusted ribcage against the sky. Holmes walked ahead, his coat buttoned tightly, his step measured. Beneath the second arch, a man stood. He was tall, his back slightly bent from labor, face drawn from years of exposure. His eyes, though bloodshot and sunk into shadow, still carried a glint that reminded me of Charlotte's. "You brought the doctor," he said quietly. "I rarely go far without him," Holmes replied. "You are Michael?" "I was," the man said. "Now I'm just someone who couldn't forget." He pulled a photograph from his coat and held it up. It was the same one we had found in the hidden mirror, Charlotte, standing beside a linden tree, expression blank. "She sent me this. 15 years ago. No note. Just this." "Why then?" Holmes asked. "Because she remembered." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of brine and soil. She wasn't supposed to, Michael whispered. That was the deal. Marianne raised her in exchange for forgetting. Raised her? I echoed. He nodded. Our mother was already ill. Father had gone. Marianne, cousin, half-sister, who knows, stepped in, took Charlotte away, said it would be better. And you? Holmes asked. I stayed. The help kept quiet. The neighbours assumed I was a servant's boy. I watched from the orchard, watched them all pretend. He exhaled, until Charlotte turned 12. Holmes said nothing. She wandered back to the orchard one night, saw me, knew me. I don't know how, but she did. What happened then? They locked her away, said she had fallen, lost her mind, put her in the attic for weeks. Marianne tried to erase it all again, letters burned, clothing changed, even her gait. They made her walk differently, like she was being rebuilt. His voice cracked. But she kept that one shoe, the one I gave her when we were children. I used to sneak food to her through the floorboards. She kept it like a totem. Holmes took a step forward. And then? Michael looked out over the river. I left. I couldn't watch her fade anymore. She stopped writing. I thought maybe they'd broken her completely. Until the drawing arrived, Holmes said. Yes. The sun was falling now, a pale golden line sliding beneath the edge of the sky. She never stopped remembering, Holmes said gently. Michael nodded, eyes wet, but she couldn't carry it alone. Holmes placed a hand on the man's shoulder. You gave her the only truth she had left. We parted with few words. As we crossed the viaduct, I looked back once. Michael was still standing there, the photograph in his hand. The river moved slowly below, like time that had nowhere left to go. Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. It was past 10 o'clock when we returned to Baker Street. The lamps outside hissed softly as fog thickened, wrapping itself around the city like gauze on a wound. Holmes had not spoken since we left the viaduct. Even the usual creak of the stairs under his feet felt subdued, as though the house itself anticipated what would follow. Inside, Mrs. Hudson had left the hearth burning low. A note sat folded neatly on the table. No name, no salutation, only a hastily scribbled line. If you value the truth, come before dawn. Ashcroft Hall, the East Wing. Holmes read it without expression, but I noticed the slight tightening at the corner of his mouth. It's her, I said quietly. Holmes nodded, or someone pretending to be. He paced once around the room, then opened the cabinet beneath his desk, removing a small leather case. You mean to go? I asked. Of course. Lies grow bold in the final hour. He paused. But this time, Watson, I go alone. I started to protest, but he held up a hand. If it's a trap, it is one I must walk into willingly. There is a final card to be played, and whoever has sent this intends to turn it face up tonight. He adjusted his coat and added almost offhandedly, Wait no more than 2 hours. If I do not return, alert Lestrade. And with that, he was gone. I waited in silence. Minutes crawled. I stoked the fire. I reviewed his notes. I even returned to the pouch of photographs, studying Charlotte's expression in each, wondering what her eyes might say now, were she alive, whether they would accuse or forgive, or simply look through me, as if past and present had blurred beyond repair. At exactly 1 hour and 42 minutes, the door burst open. Holmes staggered in, cloak torn at the shoulder, his right hand streaked with mud and dried blood. Watson, he gasped, do not speak. Ink, paper, now. I scrambled to provide them. He sat at the desk, scrawling with feverish speed. His writing was ragged, more slashes than script, but the mind behind it remained focused, surgical. I need you to go to Lestrade within the hour, he said, not looking up. Tell him to come to Ashcroft Hall with 3 men and a warrant. East wing, cellar chamber. I blinked. Cellar? Concealed under the floor of the abandoned nursery, behind the hearth. She keeps them there. She. Holmes's eyes flicked to mine. Not Marianne. I froze. You mean... Miss Greaves, he said. The housekeeper. But she's barely spoken. Exactly. He continued writing. She was dismissed 15 years ago, rehired privately 6 months before Charlotte's death. Her birth name is not Greaves. It is Grieveson, daughter of Arthur Grieveson, once personal valet to the Ashcrofts. A quiet man, lived in the servants' quarters, died penniless. His daughter blamed the family, specifically Marianne, for his fall. He dropped the pen, exhaling hard. She waited decades to strike, not through violence, but by becoming indispensable. She whispered doubt into Charlotte, exacerbated her fears, manipulated Marianne's guilt, and when the house began to collapse under its own secrets, she sealed the floorboards behind her. Holmes, that's... I found her tonight, Watson. In the East Wing. She left the note, lured me back, offered a confession of sorts. He looked down at his hands. She meant to kill me. Thought I was alone. My blood ran cold. Are you hurt? Number. He straightened, though his hand trembled faintly. But she won't be far behind. She's no longer hiding. The moment she realizes I escaped, she will flee, or burn the entire house to ash. I rose at once. Then we must go. Now. By the time we reached Ashcroft Hall again, Lestrade was already en route with 2 officers, and Holmes had regained much of his usual precision. We crossed the lawn in silence, the eastern sky beginning to pale behind the trees. Inside, the east wing was colder than I remembered. The air was stale, unmoving. Dust hung in sheets across the corridor, disturbed only by faint footprints, 1 set going in, 2 coming out. We reached the nursery. Holmes moved to the hearth and began tapping along the base. A hollow thud answered him. With a quick motion, he pushed aside the grate and pried open the stones behind. A hidden door swung inward. Stairs descended into darkness. We lit 2 lanterns. What we found below was not a cellar, but a chamber, meticulously kept, clean, silent, with rows of boxes, each labelled in cursive, shoes, ribbons, letters, hairpins, personal artifacts, Charlotte's. Holmes approached a wooden chair by the far wall. Upon it sat a single shoe, left-footed, child-sized, leather worn nearly through. She took them one by one, Holmes whispered. Every memory, every fragment of Charlotte not moulded by Marianne. At that moment, we heard footsteps above. Lestrade had arrived. Holmes stepped away from the chair. She's still here, he said. And indeed, when Lestrade descended, his men seized a figure crouched just beyond the stairwell. Miss Greaves. Her eyes were wide, lips twitching, muttering something under her breath. They wore her down, she hissed, until she forgot how to scream. And then they called it silence. Lestrade moved to restrain her, but she didn't resist. Only stared at Holmes with a gaze of glass and smoke. You should have left the floorboards shut. Holmes watched her go without reply. Later, as the sun rose over Ashcroft's crumbling gables, Holmes stood at the threshold one last time. You knew from the start? I asked. I suspected, he murmured. But her silence was not the kind of silence I could decipher immediately. And now... Holmes turned to me, eyes sharper than ever. Now I see the pattern. He glanced back at the steps behind us. Grief shapes memory, but obsession preserves it. And with that he turned from the house, and the final illusion it had held. Chapter 14. The Final Clue Revealed. The east wing of Ashcroft Hall had long since fallen silent when we returned to Baker Street later that morning. Holmes, though weary, refused to sleep. He paced the sitting room in rhythmic steps, pausing only to toss another coal onto the fire. I sat across from him, nursing a second cup of coffee, trying to piece together the parts of the puzzle he had not yet explained. "What troubles me," he said at last, "is not what Miss Greaves did, but what she allowed to happen." I set the cup down. "Explain." He turned to the desk and lifted the case files, flipping to the first photograph, the one Charlotte had hidden beneath the mirror. Miss Greaves despised the Ashcrofts. She could not undo what had been done to her father, but she could rot them from within. She needed access, which Marianne gave her. She needed silence, which guilt provided. He passed the photograph to me. "But there's one thing she could not forge. The drawing." I frowned. "The child's drawing? The one we found in Charlotte's journal?" Holmes nodded. "Yes. It depicted her and her brother, Michael, beneath the orchard tree. That sketch proved one thing no testimony could," Charlotte remembered. Remembered the brother they said never existed. Precisely. Which meant Miss Greaves's efforts to rewrite the family history were always incomplete. He paused. "And it explains why Marianne died." I sat up. "You believe Miss Greaves killed her?" "No," Holmes said, voice low. "Charlotte did." My stomach dropped. He walked to the window, staring out into the grey haze of morning. By accident, perhaps. In anger. In despair. But Marianne's death came just weeks after the drawing reappeared. I believe the act of remembering, fully, violently, unraveled her. He turned back. But instead of reporting the death, Miss Greaves concealed it, staged it, repositioned the scene, altered the timing, and invented the tale of a fall. Because if Charlotte had killed Marianne, it validated everything Greaves had worked toward: the destruction of the Ashcroft, name, the collapse of their legacy. But wouldn't the truth incriminate Greaves too? She didn't care by then. She was too far gone. Besides, he said, voice softening, she saw Charlotte not as a murderer, but as a mirror. Someone remade in grief. Someone who, like her, could not scream without tearing herself apart. We sat in silence for a long moment. Then Holmes crossed to his bookshelf, retrieving a slim journal. Miss Greaves kept meticulous notes, not about the crime, but about Charlotte's behaviours, her pacing, her murmurs, her fear of mirrors. He opened the book and turned it to a marked page. June 8th, she scratched at the panel again, said there were names hidden in the dust. Then she sat still, repeating one phrase until her voice cracked. "I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it." I shivered. She remembered. I whispered. Holmes closed the journal. Yes, but it was too late. There was a knock at the door. Lestrade entered, coat damp with rain, and gave a tight nod. "We've confirmed the identity," he said. "The remains under the nursery hearth belong to Marianne Ashcroft. Charlotte's drawing was dated 4 days after her death." He handed Holmes a sealed envelope. "Also, your theory about the inheritance was correct. Marianne left the estate not to her relatives, but to a charitable trust she never named. Greaves intercepted the will and destroyed it. We found a scorched corner in the kitchen stove." "Convenient," Holmes murmured. Lestrade gave a dry smile. "She's not talking now, only stares at her hands, keeps asking for a shoe that doesn't exist." Holmes said nothing. Lestrade gave a small shrug and turned to leave. But just before the door closed, he added, "The press is calling it the parlour rug murder. You might want to offer them something more accurate." and then he was gone. That evening, Holmes sat by the fire, sorting the last of the case notes. He arranged the drawings, letters, and photographs with the precision of a surgeon laying out his tools. "What title will you give it, Watson?" he asked without looking up. I thought a moment. "The Riddle of the Mismatched Shoes." Holmes gave the faintest of smiles. A fitting name, one shoe to remember and one to forget. "And yet," I said, "she left both behind." He nodded, because the truth, once recalled, cannot be worn quietly. We sat in silence. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the ghosts that had been unearthed from beneath its oldest floorboards. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The invitation was Holmes's idea. Written in his neat, angular hand, it was delivered by messenger to 5 addresses across London and 1 in Hampshire. Each bore the same clipped line. "You are requested to attend a private inquiry concerning the matter at Ashcroft Hall, 221B Baker Street. Noon." Holmes sent them out without further comment, then spent the better part of the morning arranging the sitting room with an almost theatrical precision, clearing the hearth, setting 6 chairs in a semicircle, and placing a single object in the center, a child's leather shoe, worn and buckled, resting atop a white cloth. "I don't suppose tea is part of the arrangement?" I asked dryly. "This is not a gathering for comfort," Holmes replied. "It is a reckoning." I didn't press further. Shortly before noon, the first to arrive was Miss Clarissa Bramble, the Ashcroft family's solicitor, whose sharp eyes scanned the room with a hawk's suspicion. She said nothing, only pursed her lips and took a seat. Next came Inspector Lestrade, grudging, hat in hand, already scowling. "I still don't see why we couldn't have done this at the Yard." "Because the truth," Holmes replied calmly, "rarely flourishes in institutions." He offered the inspector a chair, then returned to his place near the mantel. Following Lestrade came 2 faces I had not expected to see again. Philip Addleton, Charlotte's cousin and heir presumptive, and Mrs. Beryl Harting, former nurse to Marianne in her final years. Addleton arrived with a sheen of polite disdain, offering Holmes a curt nod. "I presume this is about the will?" "No," Holmes said. "This is about the lie you helped bury." Addleton blinked, faltered, then silently took his seat. Mrs. Harting entered more cautiously, hands trembling slightly as she removed her gloves. "I only did what I was told," she murmured as she sat. "Indeed," Holmes replied, "as did the last woman who died in that house." The final arrival came last. Sergeant Barnes from the local Hampshire constabulary, who had first reported the matter as a fall from a staircase in Ashcroft Hall. He nodded at Lestrade, then turned to Holmes with an expectant frown. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, "we're here. What is this about?" Holmes straightened. For a long moment, he simply looked at them, his gaze sweeping from one face to the next. Then he gestured to the shoe. "Do any of you recognize this?" They leaned in, some curious, some feigning disinterest. Addleton raised an eyebrow. "It's a child's shoe. I dare say half the houses in England would not have buried it beneath a false hearth," Holmes interrupted. "Nor would they have kept it as the last physical token of a girl whom they swore had no siblings, no trauma, and certainly no reason to draw the orchard tree with 2 figures beneath it." Silence followed. Holmes continued. "I summoned you here because the facts of Charlotte Ashcroft's death, her mother's apparent accident, and the decades-long conspiracy of inheritance are no longer rumors. They are truth, unearthed, documented, and, most critically, recorded in your own statements, which contradict one another." He turned toward Miss Bramble. You filed a will that no longer exists, a will that left the estate to Philip Addleton. Bramble stiffened. That is correct. And yet, Holmes said, you were the one who informed Greaves of its contents, were you not? She paled. Your handwriting matches the unsigned envelope found in the Ashcroft Hall study drawer. A note slipped to Miss Greaves weeks before Marianne's fall. He will inherit. You may wish to reconsider your position. Bramble said nothing. Holmes turned now to Addleton. You arrived at Ashcroft Hall within days of Marianne's death. You claimed to be checking on Charlotte's health, but records show no correspondence between you and the family for over a year prior. Addleton flushed. I was grieving. No, Holmes said coldly. You were manoeuvring. Then to Mrs. Harting, you too are complicit. Your testimony that Marianne slipped on the stairs has been contradicted by floor impressions, bruising patterns, and a page from your own journal found in the back of Charlotte's piano, where you hid it the night she died. Harting began to weep quietly. It wasn't supposed to happen, she whispered. She was just screaming. Lestrade cleared his throat. Holmes, this is bordering on an inquest. No, Lestrade. This is a reconstruction. Holmes stepped to the centre and picked up the shoe. Charlotte Ashcroft remembered. Not just the orchard, not just her brother's voice, but the moment everything went wrong. Her mother's anger, her own fear, and the silence that followed. Miss Greaves took that silence and shaped it into something monstrous. He looked back at the group. But each of you, each, played your part. You fed the lie, smoothed it over, looked away, some for inheritance, some for protection, some simply out of cowardice. No one spoke. Holmes placed the shoe back down. And now, he said, his voice low, the lie is done. He turned away from them all and crossed to the window. Outside, rain had begun to fall in light, drifting veils across the street. Watson rose, his voice gentle. What happens now? Holmes didn't turn around. That depends on whether they still believe silence can save them. The shoe remained in the center of the room. No one dared touch it. Chapter 16. Holmes breaks down the crime. The room remained still long after Holmes had spoken. Even Lestrade, normally the first to object when Holmes assumed the magistrate's tone, sat back in his chair, chewing on the inside of his cheek. The fire crackled faintly, its warmth failing to thaw the chill Holmes had introduced with his words. I trust, Holmes began at last, turning back to the semicircle of subdued guests, that the silence means no one here intends to contest what I've just laid out. No one did. Even Philip Addleton had gone slightly pale, his eyes fixed on the child's shoe as if it were a loaded pistol. Holmes gave a small nod. Very well. Let us proceed with the details, one by one. He stepped to his desk and pulled a thin folder from beneath a stack of case notes. To understand the present, he said, we must first acknowledge the past. 30 years ago, Ashcroft Hall was not merely a crumbling estate clinging to influence. It was a stage for a very deliberate tragedy. He opened the folder and extracted a faded photograph. This is Edward Ashcroft, younger brother of Reginald Ashcroft, Charlotte's grandfather. He was disinherited after marrying a woman of unsuitable means, though the specifics were never made public. Holmes passed the photograph to Watson, who glanced at it and frowned. I've seen him before, I murmured, in the portrait hall at Ashcroft. Indeed, Holmes said, that was not an accident. The family buried his name but kept his face, perhaps out of guilt or some residue of affection. He gestured toward the others. Edward's daughter was Marianne Ashcroft, the woman who later inherited the estate. She returned from Paris under tragic circumstances, widowed, poor, and with 2 small children in tow. One, Charlotte, the other, Michael. A ripple of surprise passed through the room. "Ah," Holmes said softly. "So we've reached the name no one wished to speak." He looked at Lestrade. "There is no birth certificate for Michael Ashcroft, no school record, no death certificate. But there are 4 drawings, 2 mentions in Marianne's early letters, and a gap in the Ashcroft family Bible large enough to suggest someone tried very hard to erase him." Watson spoke up, and yet Charlotte remembered him. "She did," Holmes said, "until she didn't." He paused, then placed a second paper on the desk, a sketch, drawn in crayon, slightly torn, and marked in a child's hand, "Me and Michael under the apple tree." Holmes tapped the paper lightly. Marianne's motive was not hatred, it was fear. Fear that her inheritance would be rescinded if the truth of Michael's birth came to light. You see, Michael was not fathered by her late husband. He was born during her time abroad, after a brief and turbulent liaison with a man of less than stellar repute. He looked to Mrs. Harting. "She confided this in you, didn't she?" The nurse trembled, then nodded. "She said it would ruin them both. She begged me to help make it disappear." "She meant the boy," Holmes said. Harting looked down. "I didn't kill him," she whispered. He just went missing. She told me he'd been taken to a cousin's. I didn't ask questions." Holmes nodded, and neither did the Ashcrofts. As long as the facade remained intact, they were content to let silence work its poison. He turned now to Addleton. But when Marianne died, when Charlotte began to remember, there was a threat. Not just to the family's reputation, but to the line of succession. That's when your interest peaked, did it not, Mr. Addleton? Addleton scowled. "You have no proof." "I have your bank statements. 2 months before Marianne's death, you paid a visit to a small physician's office in Kent. The doctor, now retired, confirmed he was asked to evaluate Charlotte for signs of mental instability. You were preparing a case for legal guardianship." "And why not?" Addleton snapped. "She was unwell. She was seeing things." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Or remembering them." He stepped back and addressed the room. "Miss Greaves's role was complicated. At first, I believe she truly wanted to help Charlotte, to shelter her. But over time, she realized the truth offered her something more valuable than loyalty: revenge. Greaves was the granddaughter of Edward Ashcroft, the man disinherited and erased. That made her Charlotte's cousin, and gave her motive not only to protect Charlotte, but to unravel the house that had forsaken her bloodline. He let the words settle. Lestrade shifted in his chair. "And the body?" "Under the hearth." Holmes's voice dropped. "Michael Ashcroft, likely killed, accidentally or otherwise, before Charlotte turned 5. His body hidden in the nursery, the room later sealed and declared off-limits. The hearth was rebuilt, the floor re-tiled, and no one spoke of the boy again." He looked now at the shoe. Except Charlotte, who carried that memory without knowing it, who feared the nursery without understanding why, and who, in the end, drew the picture that reopened the door to truth. Watson exhaled slowly. That's why she returned to the orchard, why she stood alone beneath that tree. She was grieving, Holmes said, for a brother no one let her mourn. A long pause followed. No one dared speak. Holmes set the folder down and adjusted the cuff of his sleeve. "I believe we've laid the foundation. What remains is the confession." He turned to the room, eyes calm, unblinking. "Who among you will offer it first?" No one moved. Holmes smiled faintly. "Very well. Then I shall provide that too tomorrow." And with that, he extinguished the fire, signaling the gathering was over. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. Dawn came late the next morning. A pall of grey hung over Baker Street, the kind of lightless fog that clung to windows and smothered chimneys. The coals in the fireplace had gone cold. Holmes had not slept. I found him by the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the horses of a delivery cart blur into the mist. "Shall I fetch breakfast?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "No need," he replied. "Justice is rarely hungry." I said nothing. The silence between us was not tension. It was anticipation. Holmes had already orchestrated the morning's events with the precision of a maestro. All that remained now was the final note. At 8:30, Inspector Lestrade returned. His face was grim, his coat wet with the city's sorrow. "We've arrested her," he said simply. Holmes turned. "Miss Greaves?" Lestrade nodded. She came quietly, claimed she expected it. Watson stepped forward. "She confessed." "To everything," Lestrade said. "Even more than I expected. She admitted she sent the sketch to Holmes, that she planted the shoe under the hearth, that she forged the solicitor's handwriting to bait Addleton." "And the boy?" Holmes asked quietly. Lestrade lowered his gaze. "She said she didn't kill him, that she found him already dead. Marianne in a stupor, the nurse too frightened to speak. She was a governess then, a poor girl with no say in a house of lies. But she kept the shoe, carried it with her when she left. A promise, she said, that someday she'd force them to remember." Holmes closed his eyes. "And Charlotte? She never knew the truth. Greaves made sure of it. Said she only let the girl remember enough to spark unrest, not trauma." Watson's voice was tight. "And now?" "Greaves will hang," Lestrade said. "If not for the boy, then for the blackmail and attempted extortion. The Crown is eager to close this one." Holmes opened his eyes again. "And Addleton?" Lestrade hesitated. "No proof he knew about the child. The doctor's testimony might bruise his ambitions, but he'll walk free. Ashcroft Hall will remain his, though I doubt the walls will ever sleep quietly again." There was a long, bitter pause. Holmes lit a match and set it to the edge of the sketch Greaves had sent him. The crayon flames curled inward on themselves until only ash remained. "Memory is a cruel servant," he said softly, "but a faithful one." Watson poured 2 cups of tea. He handed one to Holmes, who took it absently, lost in the pale swirl of rising steam. "Do you believe her?" Watson asked. Holmes didn't answer right away. "She told the truth she had rehearsed," he said finally. "But the entire truth? I doubt even she knew that." He turned to face me, eyes colder than I'd seen in weeks. "There was no accident. Marianne may have cracked beneath guilt or grief, but I believe the boy died at someone's hand. We may never know who, but we now know why it was buried." Lestrade made a noise of disagreement. "Justice is not guesswork, Holmes." "No," Holmes replied. "Justice is silence made audible." The clock struck 9. Lestrade finished his tea in one final gulp. "We'll file it as solved. Greaves gave us a narrative the Crown will accept. Let the newspapers chew on that for a fortnight. We'll all sleep a little easier." Holmes gave a curt nod, and Lestrade took his leave. The door closed. The flat fell quiet again. Holmes stood there for a while, unmoving, until at last he took his violin from the corner and sat by the window. I didn't ask for music. He played anyway. A low, mournful piece, a slow series of notes rising and collapsing like breath. It wasn't any composition I knew, and I don't think Holmes intended it to be one. It was not for me or the papers, or even for Greaves. It was for the orchard, for two children beneath a tree no longer there, for the dirt beneath the parlour rug, for the silence that grew teeth. When the last note faded, Holmes set the violin down and rose without a word. He slipped on his coat and took his hat. "Where are you going?" I asked. He looked over his shoulder. "To return something that should never have been hidden." And with that, he stepped into the fog. Justice in Holmes' world was rarely neat. It did not always end with a trial or a headline, but it always ended with the truth, even when that truth was too late to help the living or too heavy for the dead. Chapter 18. Holmes' final reflection. The fire had burned low in our sitting room when Holmes finally returned. His boots were streaked with mud. His collar bore the scent of distant countryside. But his posture was composed, his step steady, as if, in retracing the past, he had finally reached its edge. He removed his coat without a word and hung it by the hearth. The air in Baker Street held its usual scent of pipe smoke and violin rosin. Outside, the fog had lifted, revealing a cold, clear sky. "I took the train to Ashcroft this morning," Holmes said, as if continuing a thought I had not heard. "Walked to the orchard. The tree is gone, felled by rot years ago, according to the groundskeeper. But the soil remembers." He sat across from me. On the small table between us lay a small object wrapped in cloth. I did not ask what it was. "She had it sewn into the hem of her governess coat," Holmes continued quietly. "The second shoe. Greaves couldn't bring herself to bury it. Said it was the only part of him she could carry." "You buried it," I said softly. "In the orchard," Holmes nodded, "where he drew with his sister, where he should have been mourned." There was a silence between us then, deep and gentle. "And the family?" I asked at last. "Addleton has already begun legal proceedings to seal all records," Holmes replied. "By month's end, the estate will be his uncontested. Charlotte has been placed in the care of distant relatives, quiet people. I believe they will let her remember." He reached for his pipe, lit it, then exhaled a long stream of smoke toward the ceiling. "Lestrade's report will say it was blackmail," he added, "an ambitious servant, consumed by resentment, that the body beneath the nursery hearth was a cruel trick. The boy, a fabrication, the documents, forged." I leaned forward. "But you don't believe that?" Holmes shook his head. "Number. But the truth is less valuable than the narrative now. The Crown has its culprit, society, its resolution, and I have seen the shape of the wound." There was something in his tone, something almost tender. I looked to him. "You once told me, Holmes, that you cared only for logic. That sentiment clouded the mind." "I did," he said, "and in most cases it does. But not this one." He met my gaze. "This was never a case of deduction, Watson. It was a case of memory, buried, reshaped, resisted, and memory, like the finest silk thread, cannot be pulled too tightly, else it snaps." He rose, walked to the window, and looked out over the rooftops of London. The city, indifferent as ever, rolled onward beneath a slate-grey sky. "I have solved 100 crimes," Holmes murmured, "uncovered motives that defied comprehension. But this was not about motive. It was about erasure. What a family deletes to survive. What a child forgets to endure. What guilt does when it's passed down like heirloom silver, polished, hidden, and untouched." I said nothing. Words just then felt clumsy. After a while, Holmes turned back toward the room. "You'll write it up, of course." I nodded. with discretion. "Good," he said. "Call it what you will. Just ensure no one forgets there was a boy." He moved to his desk, leafed through the pile of new telegrams waiting for him. I saw the glint of fresh intrigue in his eye already. Another puzzle, another silence waiting to be disturbed. Holmes never lingered. That was both his strength and his curse. "Will you take a case today?" I asked. He paused, looked at the fireplace. "No," he said, "not today." And for once I was glad. Because some mysteries, however elegantly solved, leave behind something heavier than justice. They leave truth, quiet, irrevocable. And, like the small shoe buried beneath a forgotten orchard, they rest not for closure, but because someone finally remembered to lay them down.